Today's story is quiet to the point of being unsettling, set against the wide-open silence of the American West, where loneliness stretches farther than the horizon and secrets sink deep into the dust. It's a place where survival is never guaranteed, and where two broken lives can cross in ways neither one expects. It begins with a simple request for water, small enough to seem harmless, yet powerful enough to awaken something that had been buried for years. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The Texas hill country kept its truths buried, pressed into limestone, tangled in cedar roots, scorched by a sun that bleached whatever failed to endure. Etta Crowley had become one of those truths, folded so deeply into the land that she sometimes forgot she had ever been anything else. She was 28, a mail-order bride whose husband died 3 weeks after she arrived, leaving her marooned on a rough patch of ranch land with no money to go east and no future that didn't ask her to give up the last scraps of control she'd clawed together. She stayed because staying was the only choice that didn't turn her into someone else's possession. And she learned to get by on grit and a small garden that barely kept her fed through seasons built to break a person. Her marriage had been short and savage. 3 weeks of lessons in what men demanded from wives, and how little that had to do with anything she wanted or needed. Silas Rourke was a hard man, sharpened by years of wrestling stubborn soil and living off an unforgiving range. He treated her body the way he treated stock, a thing to be used, comfort and preference be damned. In those weeks, she learned to shut her eyes and wait, to pull her mind away from her skin, to hover somewhere numb until the grunts and pressure ended and she could be alone again. When death finally took him, the relief shamed her. Freedom tasted bitter because she hadn't loved him, hadn't even liked him. And when they lowered him into the packed earth, she felt nothing but a vast, frightening release. 2 years passed. 2 years of quiet labor and solitary survival. Etta nearly convinced herself she was content, that the absence of touch was better than the kind she'd known, that her body was safer forgotten, built for work, not pleasure. She buried desire so deep, she sometimes wondered if it had ever lived at all. If the dreams she carried west had only been a girl's misunderstanding of what marriage meant. Then Nokai entered her life the way storms roll across open plains. Sudden, overpowering, impossible to ignore. She was bent over her garden when hoofbeats reached her. She looked up to see a rider coming in from the east, moving with the easy balance of someone born to a saddle, never comfortable anywhere else. Her hand found the rifle she kept close, always, because a woman alone couldn't afford to be careless. But there was something in the rider's posture, in the measured way he came on, that told her this wasn't an attack. His purpose carried no violence. He halted at the edge of her land and waited. She understood he was asking leave, honoring a boundary she hadn't known she'd drawn. She lowered the rifle. Not all the way, but enough. He read the signal and urged his horse forward until she could see him clearly. He looked about 30, his features cut from the same sun-burned country that surrounded them. Sharp lines, weathered plains, eyes so dark they seemed to hold night inside. His hair hung long and black, threaded with feathers she couldn't read, and beneath plain clothes his body was lean and powerful. A hunter's build meant for speed and force, both held in check. The realization struck her like a stumble. He was the most beautiful man she had ever seen. "Water," he said, his voice low and steady, the voice of someone who didn't need to raise it. His English carried an accent, but came clear. "My horse needs water. I've been riding 2 days." And she should have said no. Everything she'd been taught, every whisper from settlers about Indians, about the Apache, warned that letting one onto her land was madness. Kindness, they said, bought violence. Safety meant distance or death. But 2 years alone had taught Etta that the people who whispered loudest were often the same ones who'd seen her bruises and called Silas's cruelty a man's right, who told her to be a better wife, who divided the world to suit themselves. "The trough's by the barn," she heard herself say. "Help yourself." He nodded, a small dip of his head that carried thanks, and rode toward the barn with the same easy grace. She watched him go. She watched how horse and rider moved as one, the roll of muscle under bronze skin, the spill of black hair over broad shoulders, and felt something stir she thought had died, something she believed Silas had buried along with her softer hopes. She turned back to her garden and pretended to work, but her attention kept pulling toward the barn, toward the sound of water, toward the presence of this stranger who had unsettled the careful balance of her days. When he came back leading his horse and approached again at that same deliberate pace, she realized she'd stopped pretending altogether. Her focus fixed on him with an intensity that should have embarrassed her and somehow didn't. "You live alone," he said. "No judgment, only curiosity, and something like recognition." "My husband died 2 years ago," she answered. "And you did not return to your people?" "I don't have people." The truth slipped out raw and unguarded. "I came as a mail-order bride. The man I married was a stranger. Where I came from holds nothing for me. So I stayed." He studied her, those dark eyes taking in the calloused hands, the sun-toughened skin, the way she held herself like someone who'd learned to expect blows and built walls to take them. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen. Not as a body to be used, but as a person to be understood. "Among my people," he said at last, "a woman who stands alone is a fighter. She has chosen battles most never face without help. That is not weakness. It is a kind of strength few possess." The words settled in a quiet place inside her, a place she had forgotten was there. No one had ever called her strong. Not her parents, who had been glad to see her sent west, not her husband, who had named her weak and worthless in voices that still crept into her dreams. Not the neighbors who passed through now and then, shaking their heads and predicting her failure with something close to hope. "What is your name?" she asked. She needed a name, something solid to hold this moment in place. "My people call me No Kai," he said. "In your language it means black horse. The soldiers at the forts use other names. I do not answer to names given by enemies." "I'm Etta," she said. "Etta Crowley." He repeated it slowly, as if testing the sound, learning its weight. "Etta. I must keep moving," he went on. "But I will remember the woman who gave water to a stranger when she had every reason not to. Perhaps I will ride this way again." He swung up onto his horse with an ease that made it look effortless. She watched him go, watched until he became a dark mark against the sky. Then nothing at all. She was alone again with her garden and her thoughts, and the uneasy certainty that something had shifted, even if she could not yet name it. And he did come back. Once, then again, then again. In the months that followed, Black Horse appeared at her place too often to be chance. There was always a reason. Water for his horse, a place to rest on a long ride, trade goods he claimed she might use. She accepted his visits with a guarded tiredness that slowly gave way to expectation. She began watching the horizon for him, cooking more than one person needed, lying awake at night wondering what his touch might feel like. They talked when he came, at first about practical things, then about matters closer to the bone. He spoke of his people, of the Apache way of life being ground down by expansion, treaties, and a world that saw them as obstacles instead of human beings. She spoke of her own life, of a marriage that taught her to fear closeness, of a loneliness so familiar she sometimes mistook it for her nature. When she spoke of Silas Rourke, his face darkened with something like restrained fury, a protectiveness that startled her. "Among my people," he said one night, after she revealed more than she meant to, "a man who treats a woman as you were treated would be driven out. Women are not property. They are partners, equals, the other half of what makes a person whole. What your husband did was not marriage. It is something else. We have no word for it, because it is not something we do." "It seemed normal to me," she said quietly. The admission tasted like shame. "I thought that was what marriage was. I thought something was wrong with me for not wanting it." "There is nothing wrong with you," he said, his voice steady, unyielding. There was something wrong with him, and something wrong with a world that taught you to believe otherwise. The change from friendship to something deeper came the way such changes always did, slowly, then all at once. One evening, with the sun dropping low and the hills burning gold, he reached out and touched her face. Just that. His palm warm on her cheek, his thumb tracing her jaw. Her body locked in an old reflex, and he pulled back immediately, his hand falling to his side. "I'm sorry," he said, and the regret in his voice was real. "I should have asked." "No," she said, before she could stop herself. "Don't apologize. I want—" She faltered, searching for words she had denied herself for years. "I want to be touched. I just don't know how anymore. I don't know how not to be afraid." "Then we learn," he said, stepping closer with care, leaving her space to move away. When she didn't, he sat beside her on the rough bench facing west, near enough that she felt his warmth, not touching. Not yet. "We learn together," he said, "at your pace, for as long as it takes. I've waited months to sit this close to you. I can wait longer if you need it." "Why?" The question held everything she couldn't understand. Why wait for a woman like me? A white widow who flinches like a beaten horse? Why not choose someone easier? Someone less damaged? "Because I don't want easier. I want you." His gaze held hers, steady and intent. "Because the first time I saw you in your garden, rifle in hand, defiance in your eyes, I felt something I hadn't felt since my wife died 5 years ago. Because watching you endure, watching you build a life from nothing, watching you refuse to bow to a world that wants you broken, that has made me respect you beyond anything physical. You are not broken, Etta. You are bent, perhaps, from carrying what was never yours to carry. Bent things can be made straight again, if they are handled with care." Her tears broke loose without warning, rushing down her face with a force that startled her. She hadn't cried in years, had trained herself to believe tears were weakness, that showing any soft place only invited harm. Yet something in his words, in the calm certainty with which he spoke them, split the wall she'd built. What poured out carried years of fear and grief, the aching solitude of a woman who had learned to expect no more than what she'd been given. He gathered her up while she wept, his arms firm but careful, meant to steady rather than cage. He didn't hush her, didn't urge strength or silence. He simply held her and let the storm run its course. When the sobbing finally eased, when she'd emptied herself of something bitter that had lived inside her too long, she lifted her face and felt a new sensation take hold. It might have been hope. "Teach me," she whispered. "Teach me how to want again. Teach me that touch can be something other than what I learned." "It would be my honor," Nokai said. Then he kissed her, slow and gentle, A kiss that asked instead of claimed, that offered instead of took. The weeks that followed became lessons in tenderness, a patient undoing of everything Silas Rourke had taught her about closeness. Nokai moved with care, always with care, showing her that hands could be gentle, that desire didn't have to bruise, that her body wasn't something to be taken from, but a place to be discovered with attention. His touch made her breathe out pleasure instead of bracing for pain. And whenever fear tightened her, whenever old reflexes stiffened her body, he stopped at once, held her, waited until she was ready. In those weeks, she learned she could feel pleasure, that the parts of herself she'd shut down still carried nerves capable of song when touched right. She learned she had wants, real, specific wants, buried beneath habit and fear, wants she was beginning to name and ask for. She learned intimacy could be a dialogue instead of a demand, that her presence wasn't merely permitted, but necessary. The night they finally crossed that last line began like any other evening they'd shared. They ate, talked about small things and big ones, then moved to the bed that once belonged to Silas, but had long since become hers. Nokai lay beside her, tracing slow paths along her arm, and she felt the familiar stirring that grew less frightening by the day. "I want more," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I want all of it. I want to know what it's like to be with someone I choose. Someone who sees me as a person, not a use." "Are you sure?" His tone was soft, leaving space for her to turn back if she needed. "I'm sure." She sat up and undressed, her hands shaking only a little, watching his face as she revealed herself. What she saw there wasn't the greedy hunger she'd learned to fear, but something closer to awe, an attention that made her feel beautiful instead of exposed. He undressed as well, and she took him in without shame. The lean strength, the warmth of his skin, his desire plain but not threatening. He lay back, then did something she hadn't expected, something that shifted everything. He guided her above him. "Your turn," he said, his gaze steady and intent. "Show me what you want." Etta froze, hovering there, unable to grasp what he was offering. Her experience was narrow, shaped by Silas's blunt needs. A woman didn't choose. She lay still and waited for it to end. She certainly didn't set the pace or decide how deep or how slow. No one had ever asked what she wanted, because it had never mattered. She faltered. "I don't know how. I don't know what I want. I don't understand what you're asking." "You do," Nokai said. His hands settled on her hips, not steering, not pressing, just there, grounding her. "You know what feels good. You've learned what makes you breathe sharp and what makes you sigh. Use that. Move the way that brings you pleasure. Choose the rhythm that feels right. I'm here for you, Etta. Use me." The words should have sounded harsh. They should have echoed the way Silas used her. They didn't. They sounded like permission, like freedom, like an invitation to claim something that had always been hers, but never allowed. She moved carefully at first, shifting until she found an angle that sparked sensation instead of pain. His hand stayed steady at her hips, offering reassurance without control, letting her know every choice was right. She moved again, and the friction sent sparks up her spine. A sound escaped her. Pure, unguarded pleasure, unfamiliar and honest. "Yes," he breathed, and the encouragement carried her forward, letting her try, letting her discover what her body wanted once it was allowed to want. She found she liked to start slow, building heat instead of drowning in it. She learned she liked leaning forward, changing the angle until pressure landed in places that stole her breath. She learned she liked watching his face, seeing the pleasure she gave him, while claiming her own. She learned, truly learned, that she wasn't a passenger here, but an equal. That her desire wasn't an inconvenience, but the guide. She understood then that she was not being carried along, but actively choosing. That her wants were not obstacles to be endured, but signals meant to be read and honored. When the crest finally came, it bore no resemblance to anything she had known in her marriage. Nothing she had imagined her body capable of. It rose slowly, gathering heat and pressure, something she sensed approaching without being able to seize. Until Nokai's hands firmed at her hips, not to command, but to steady her. And he spoke her name with a rough breath that told her he was close as well. Something split wide inside her. The feeling surged from deep in her center and raced outward until every nerve rang bright and loud. She cried out, open, unfiltered, and felt him follow her, his body tightening beneath hers as release took him too. Then she folded against his chest, shaking in the aftermath, tears slipping free. Not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming relief of finally feeling goodness where she had learned to expect only hurt. That, she said at last, when words returned, that's what it's supposed to feel like. That's what it can feel like, he corrected softly, wrapping her close. When both people are here, when both matter, when the aim isn't finishing, but connection, that's what care looks like. She lifted her head. In the dim cabin light, his face was easy and content, untouched by the distant indifference she remembered from Silas Rourke. He looked at her as if she were precious, as if she had given him something rather than merely fulfilled a duty. I didn't know, she whispered, years of believing she deserved less packed into the words. I thought something was wrong with me. I thought I was broken, that I couldn't feel what other women felt. I thought it was my fault. It never was, he said. He brushed her hair back with a tenderness that nearly undid her again. The fault was a man who didn't know how to be a partner, who saw only himself. The fault was a world that taught you his cruelty was normal, that your pain was a failure. But you are not broken, Etta. You never were. You were waiting for someone who could see you. They came together again before dawn. And this time she moved with new confidence, riding the moment with a certainty that would have been impossible hours earlier. She tried different rhythms and angles, learned when speed thrilled and when slowness deepened the feeling, learned how leaning back could pull sensation until her breath caught. She learned that her pleasure wasn't an afterthought. It was the center. Morning found them tangled in pale light through the cabin's single window. She felt changed from the woman who had fallen asleep, not erased, still herself with every scar, but shifted, newly aware of what she could feel and what she deserved. What happens now? She asked, the future edging in despite the glow of the present. Now we build, he said, together. It won't be easy. My people and yours aren't at peace, and some will condemn what we've found. But I promise I will never touch you the way your husband did. I promise your pleasure will always matter as much as mine. Every time we come together, you decide yes or no, how far, how fast. You show me what you want. And if what you want changes, tomorrow, next year, we learn that too. That's partnership, he continued. Not a fixed bargain, but a living conversation, learning, adapting, growing. You aren't the woman you were 2 years ago, or even 2 months ago. You won't be the same woman 2 years from now, and I won't be the same man. But if we keep talking, keep listening, keep placing each other's needs beside our own, we can meet whatever comes. The years proved him right, and not easy. There were frictions with his people and with hers. times when the world beyond their small ranch seemed determined to pry them apart. But they faced each test together, night after night, most nights. They returned to each other in ways that strengthened what they'd laid down that first evening. The night he set her above him and handed her a power she hadn't known she possessed. Over time, she learned that desire isn't fixed. It shifts and deepens. As she grew more at home in her body, more certain of her right to ask, she learned to speak, telling Nokai what felt right and what didn't, guiding his hands and mouth to the places that answered her best. She learned intimacy could be playful, threaded with laughter as easily as breathless sounds, a source of joy rather than mere completion. And she learned that the gift he offered that night, agency, choice, command of her own pleasure, wasn't a single moment, but a promise renewed every time. Each time they came together, she owned her experience. Each time she showed him what she wanted, he met it with unfailing generosity, his devotion to her pleasure steady and sure. Years later, with a life built full, children and grandchildren, grief and happiness, decades of partnership, she would sometimes return to that first night, to the instant everything turned, the moment he placed her above him. "Your turn," he said. "Show me what you want." Such simple words. Such a radical truth. That what she wanted mattered. That her wanting carried weight. That desire deserved a voice. That closeness could be something she guided instead of something she survived. That night, he gave her back her body. He returned what Silas Rourke had taken and what she believed was gone for good. He showed her she wasn't damaged, that her ability to feel had only been buried under pain and habit, waiting for patience and care to bring it back to light. She never forgot it, never treated lightly the power he placed in her hands. The trust he offered, by yielding himself to her choices, left her endlessly grateful for the man who rode up asking for water and left her with something far rarer. Her life, her body, her right to want, her turn. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal/disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice, imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and is shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.